All right. So let me move that down. So this is an introduction to genealogy, three-part series, and this is part one. My name's Lillian Wingate, and I'm presenting this from the Statesboro Regional Library System. If you've ever taken any of my classes before, you'll know that even though the classes might have the same title, they're usually redone each time. I try to add information or update them each time. So we're going to get started with this. So what is genealogy? Genealogy is the study of your family lineage, backed up by documentation to prove each generation. And that is something that is very, very important, is that documentation point. DNA has changed the standard slightly in recent times, which you see commercials on TV all the time about DNA, but we'll talk more on that in a future presentation. Genealogy is also referred to as family history. And the reason for this is you must know the history of the time period your ancestors lived in to better understand their lives. You have to remember that your ancestors from 100 years ago did not live the same way that we live today. And often there is a family member who has taken on the responsibility of being the family historian. They will often have original documents and information on ancestors and even different family members. Since several of you are joining, I would kind of assume that many of you are your family historians. Unfortunately, it may be difficult to locate this person if it is not already you. So you want to ask family members if they might know who has the most family heirlooms, and that's usually a good indicator. I'm lucky that my mother was the family historian, which I've kind of taken on as well, and I have contacted those other branches of the family to find out who that family historian was to kind of carry on from there. But it takes lots of reaching out to try to find who those people are. Why should you get involved in genealogy? Well, recently, most people become interested because they want to know where their ancestors came from or what they are. And by that, they usually mean their ethnicity, especially around big holidays like St. Patrick's Day, for example. Oftentimes, this results in just people taking a simple DNA test, which answers each of those questions, and they don't pursue their research into their family any further than that. For those who do go the route of researching their family, they learn very quickly how addictive it can become. Because when you learn those little details that you never knew about your ancestors, it lights a spark in you, and it can become addictive very quickly. At some point, you or your descendants may have questions about your ancestors. You may be the only person with the answers, or at least the most information that others will need to begin researching. It could be something trivial that you have never thought about, but you're the only one with that knowledge. So don't let that information, those stories, die with you. You want to pass it on in one form or another. And I'm not saying this to kind of be morbid, but literally, if it's information, especially if you're an only child or an only grandchild, you have knowledge that no one else probably has. So your descendants may need this information in the future for medical purposes, and they don't even know where to begin. As an example of this, I'm going to actually take a short break from the PowerPoint to show an example. There we go. So real quick, this is an example of the death certificate of my great-grandfather. And I know it might be a little difficult to read, But he died, and the cause of death right here is carcinoma of bladder. So, but this wasn't something I found until years after my father passed away. And the only reason I got interested, honestly, in genealogy was because my father died of cancer, and I never knew hardly anything about his family. And I started having medical conditions, and I knew nothing. My father died of bladder cancer, and then I found out his grandfather died of bladder cancer. That's one of those things that he didn't know. So again, if you know something like that, write it down. Have some sort of note like that to pass down. People don't think about that a lot today, but it is very important to have. So I'm going to jump back to this. Have you ever wondered where your family came from, or perhaps how they came about owning a company or being in a certain profession? That's something that can be very interesting. Researching your family history can help you find answers to these and other questions. You might be surprised by what you find. Perhaps one profession was actually a disguise for something else. I have heard some very interesting stories on certain professions that might have been written in a census record or something, but it was kind of a cover-up for something else. And then some things that they thought were perfectly legitimate might have turned out to be something else. Trying to think, there's a TV show that I watched, and it gave me a whole new perspective. It was kind of a period piece, but it gave me an entirely new perspective on my great-grandfather who I just showed you. He was a Jewish immigrant from Austria and moved to New York City, where he was there for nearly 2 decades. And he was always listed as a baker. In Austria, he was a baker. In New York, he was a baker until he moved to Detroit with his family. And what's so funny about that is in Detroit, he suddenly is a street peddler. And even though he had several sons, none of his sons took on the profession of baking, which that was something he had done all of his life. But this period piece show that I had watched, it had a Jewish gentleman who was, quote, a baker, but he was actually a whiskey distillery. And he was sending alcohol to America during Prohibition. And after talking to some of my older cousins and aunts and uncles who were in Detroit, I found out that there was a purple gang of Detroit that they believe my grandfather's brothers, who were my great-grandfather's sons, who were in this purple gang, who they bootlegged alcohol to Al Capone. And it really made me think, because I have tried searching for those bakeries, so-called, that my great-grandfather worked for, and have never been able to find them. So it has made me take a new perspective. So, and I've also heard many stories on distilleries in the South during Prohibition. So certain names and certain professions can have meanings that were completely different back then, even shoemakers and so forth. So keep in mind, you might find something very interesting. And then, of course, have you ever wondered if you're related to royalty, which many people do, or a very common assumption in the South, that you have a Cherokee princess who's an ancestor. Although both of these are wonderful to have, these are two questions that you have to have research and you have to have proof. You cannot take someone else's work or even their word as proof. It doesn't matter if they say they have found it. Either of these, you have to do your own work and find the proof yourself. All right, so where do you begin when you start your genealogy? You always start with yourself, always. Even if you only want information on a second or third great-grandparent, you must first prove that that person is in fact your ancestor. And if you notice, I say that person because it is not an ancestor until you prove that it is your ancestor, which is very important. Just because it is someone who has the same name as someone in your family does not mean that that person is related to you. Now we're going to go to the 3 most important pieces of information that you need for each person in your tree. And yes, these will be repeated frequently. And they are name, date, and location. So when it comes to a name, it can be the full name, a nickname, first or last name, or even just unknown until you are able to find more information. But you want to make sure to have something there, at least as a placeholder. That's why I have unknown. Something as a placeholder until you are able to find something to prove a name. It could be Mrs. So-and-so, but you want to have Mrs. to let you know that you do not know her maiden name yet. Which goes to the second bullet. Always record women with their maiden name when possible. In your working notes, you can record all of her married names, but you always want to record her with only her maiden name. Unless, of course, you're unable to find it, and then make sure you list her as Mrs., indicating that that is a married name. As you come across records, you'll see what I mean, and in part 2, I believe, of these series, I'll show vital records, marriage records, and you'll see the difference in the maiden name, the married names, Mrs., and how you record that information. When it comes to date, you at least need a birth and a death date to narrow down this individual. Believe it or not, however unique you believe your name to be, there is almost always somebody else in the world with that same name. This is why you need to at least have an estimate of a year for a birth and a death so that you can narrow down that individual person. You can use abbreviations to let you know it's an estimate. So ABT for about, AFT after, BEF for before. And you can get these estimations because if they have a child, you know they were born before they had a child. If they did have a child again, you know they died after the child was born, at least for the female. And so if you have marriage dates or children, that can help you get that estimation for about the time period they were alive. So then you want to move on to location. You want to try to narrow down the location as much as possible when you have a name that is fairly common. Excuse me. An example of this is John Brown, Mary Jones, James Williams. I did leave out John Smith, of course, but those 3 last names are some of the top, or in the top 10 most common last names in America. So the reason I say you want to narrow down that location is because those names are so common. When it comes to a search where you have a more uncommon last name, then you're going to have to expand your location so it's not so narrow. If you do not know the specific town or the county, you want to at least list the state. If nothing else, at least list the country. Keep in mind that where a person lived in the past may not be called by the same name today because land boundaries changed over time. An example of that, of course, Bulloch County was created in 1796, but Evans and Candler County weren't created until 1914 out of portions of Bulloch County. So if someone was born in the portion of Bulloch County in, let's say, 1900, but someone has them listed as being born in Candler County in 1900. That is technically not correct because Candler County was not even created at that time. So you want to make sure to record the location that ancestor was living at the time they were, not the location it is today, but at that time period. The next steps, you want to start writing down your information. So you're going to begin with yourself, then your parents, siblings, aunts and uncles if you have them. This will give you a list of names to begin with, and many of these you'll start seeing again. You want to begin filling out a family group sheet. Always fill these out in pencil. That way you can correct mistakes you might make and/or change information once you learn the correct information. Once again, you want to begin by listing your parents at the top, you and your siblings below. There will also be space for the names of your grandparents and the spouse for you and your siblings. And I'm going to show several examples of these, but there is a great deal of information that can be filled out on these. And the reason you want to fill this out on paper is so that once you go to do an online search, you're not having to remember all of these tiny details. You will have them written down in front of you, and you're not entering in incorrect information. So you want to enter what you do know. If you don't know the information, leave it blank. So the date and location of birth, marriage, death, and burial can be listed. Occupation, religion, military service are important details. It is okay to give an estimate for a birth year in order to do research until you're able to find proof or at least a much more established estimate of a birth year. And this also applies for marriage and death year. These are some examples of different versions of a family group record or sheet. Some of them are horizontal, some of them are lateral. It's really up to you as to what kind you want to fill out. If you notice this one, it has room for 12 children. There's some that are larger that give you room to write a little bit bigger, but it has fewer spaces for children. And then, of course, you have some that are double-sided for the couples that had no TVs and had 18 children. So here's an example. This one is actually double-sided, but I only copied the one. It's not the easiest to read, but you can see how much information you're able to put in, and it does show you, what information goes where. And again, there are many different formats, and you can find most of these online. I can also send copies of these to you. So after finishing filling out your family group sheet, then you're going to do a pedigree chart, which is also called an ancestral chart. This chart will begin with yourself again, and then we'll record only your direct ancestors going backwards. So this one does not include your siblings or aunts and uncles. It begins with yourself and going backwards, So parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and depending on the chart you use, some of them only go to great-grandparents, some to your third, and then you can even find up to 15 generation pedigree charts. But that's usually for those who have been doing this for decades. As long as you follow the correct numbering system, you'll be able to keep track of the generations, but you need to stay consistent when filling out the chart. And this is something that can become very confusing. So I have an image of this, and again, if you would like the next image to be sent to you, I can do that in an email afterwards. So you will record the full name for each person, or as much of the name as you know, and then you will record the date and location of birth, marriage, and death. As the generations go back, you may not know as much specific information. There's also less room to record these details the further you go back on your pedigree chart because each generation doubles. And sometimes you might know more about just your paternal line and not as much. So if you wanted to divide those up, you could start one pedigree chart with just your father, so that you're working on his family, and one on your mother, so you're working on her family. So keep in mind there are more ways to do this. So this is a basic ancestral chart, and this is one from Ancestry. You can get free copies off Ancestry Library Edition. And so I've numbered this with the red numbers. So this is the correct numbering system. And if you notice right here, it's got number 1 on this chart is, and this would be you. And it's the same person as number on chart number. And over here it has chart number. So this would be chart number 1. So if we were to go on to a chart number 2 to work on right here, who would be your paternal great-grandfather, you could say chart number 2. So that way you could extend on each one. Excuse me. So if you wanted to start again with just your father's side and work more on these to spread out, you could do that as well. But just remember, it goes father, mother, father, mother, father, mother, and so forth. You don't want to get these mixed up constantly. This is the standard form. Now, when it comes to you, that's why I just have you. You can be male, female, it does not matter. And it does have a name of your spouse, but not necessarily all of their specifics. And also, if you notice for the female, it has born and died because the marriage information is already above. So that's one of those. This is another format of it, which is basically stretched out much more, and so it actually lets you go back further. But if you notice it, and again, it is small, but it has the numbering system here as well. And this one goes all the way down to 31. So, and those pedigree charts that go to 15 generations, they are numbered just the same, but they go out much, much further. So after you have recorded what you know, you're going to want to branch out. No pun intended. Begin contacting relatives in your immediate family for more information. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents if possible, but also your siblings and cousins. You want to do this as soon as you're able to, because you may have questions later and have no one to ask. And even if you are elderly and say you don't have parents, grandparents, siblings living, you probably do have cousins who are living. They could be second cousins or cousins who are much younger than you, but they may still know information that you don't know. They could have had a parent or grandparent who passed down stories to them that perhaps you didn't know, or you may have heard and not cared about at the time, which often happens. So just because, you know, your direct relatives are not living anymore or not close by, there are still people you can most likely reach out to. You want to try to get as many names, dates, and locations as possible. I told you those were going to be repeated again. Record these stories if possible. Some details may seem trivial at first, but could offer verification later. You do want to remember that stories and oral traditions are not proof. You still need to find some form of verification to back up these stories. I have personal handwritten letters from second great aunts that are kind of recounting tales of their grandparents. And of course, these were written when they were in their 70s. So they are telling stories, and some of them are physical features, and some of them, I remember this summer and this, and they were off by a few years and certain things like that. But after writing down a timeline of their story where they recounted, there were certain things I was able to match up with original records to prove. So even if it is just a story or someone recounting information, use that to try to verify with records. And in today's world, it is so much easier to communicate with others and record these stories. You can call or email family members all the way across the country today, or in other countries, and be able to have a conversation. In the past, this would have taken months of mailing back and forth, so take advantage of this. And today, just as we're doing, you can even use video conference or chatting, which is also good. Whenever you are talking like this, you want to write down your information and put it in your working notes. They can be added to later when more information is acquired. Excuse me. Make sure to keep these notes together and record who you got the information from. And it's also a good idea to have a notebook just for your genealogy. I've helped a lady in compiling a genealogy book before, but unfortunately, nearly every time she would call someone to get notes, she would write the notes on the back of envelopes, mail envelopes, just random pieces of paper, and not put who they were from, when she got the information, or anything. Please do not do that. Keep a notebook, try to stay organized, write down the date you got the information, who you got it from, who they got it from if possible, because you want to verify this information and at least make sure that it can be accredited. It is from a primary source perhaps, or secondary, where it came from, and see if there's anything else that could back it up. So this way, once you have more information, you can continue filling out your charts, in pencil, of course. So what information should you record and how? Always record the full names of each person when you're able to. Once again, identify the females by their maiden name. And yes, I know I've repeated this twice, but it is very important. Some people find it easier to include the married names, but if you are doing online searches and the only way you are identifying the females are with their married name, you are not going to find those results, because the way these online websites work are on algorithms. So they are going to search for that letter sequence instead of what the name is. So that is why I keep saying repeatedly, look, or only include the maiden name and then put the married name later. If the person had a nickname, you do want to record it, but you want to put it in parentheses or quotation marks after the given name, but be consistent in whatever symbols you are using. Record the date of birth and death and marriage for each person when you are able to find it. When it comes to genealogy, there is a standard for how dates are recorded. So you want to put the number for the day first, followed by the 3-letter abbreviation for the month, and then the full number for the year. And this is the standardized way for recording dates for genealogists. So I have an example at the bottom, 27 MAR 1902. The reason for this is if you wrote, with dashes in between 11/7/82, is that November 7th, 1982, or is that July 11th, 1882? That can get very confusing. And I must admit, because sometimes when I'm working on genealogy all day and then I have to sign documents, I actually mix up the dates sometimes because I write them in this format. But you need to get used to using this because, again, during today's time, almost all genealogy is being done online instead of in-house at the moment. So if you're using online search engines and things, this is the format that those dates need to be put in, because this is the format those sites will recognize. When able, you want to record the places your ancestor was born, married, lived in, and died. Excuse me. So you want to put the city, the county, the state for the US. Record the location for your ancestor as it was at the time they lived there. So I've got an example, Statesboro-Bulloch County, Georgia. And again, you can put USA also. If you're using a site where you start to type in the location and it drops down with the various locations, you always want to select the location that drops down that is correct. Do not continue to type it. And there are over 10, I can think of 10 regularly used websites, but many of them you want to pick the drop down suggestion instead of continuing to type it, because once again, these websites use algorithms. So that is the one that they recognize. Also, when you're viewing documents that people have transcribed the records, always look at the original, because sometimes those even have errors. A quick example, the 1860 census record for Bulloch County, the person who transcribed it, they put in Bulloch County, but instead of putting Georgia in the United States, they put Georgia country. So if you just save that without making sure you check certain box, all of a sudden you have your ancestor living in Europe. So make sure you're looking and making sure that the location on the original document is the same as the transcription that has been recorded. And again, if you don't know the exact location, go broader. Just list a country or a state, only a state, or even the country. A more specific location will narrow down the results for searching later. Counties are also very important. If your family lived in the same location for a long period of time, it's very important to know the history of the location and when counties were created. And maps are incredibly important when it comes to genealogy. Older maps especially. I have them all over my office and at home. You need to know when counties were created and which ones they were created from for various states. I'll be doing a future class that has several links to sites like that. But just because a family lived in the same place, records might indicate that they lived in several, when in fact they did not move, it's just the county lines moving. So keep that in mind. So this is more information to think about. As America progressed, states were created out of colonies, counties were created out of parishes, and then counties and territories. So think about the time period that your ancestor lived in and where. They may have had limited access to the nearest town, therefore there may be less recorded information on them. Records might have been recorded in a different county. So for example, Bulloch County is a very large county and used to be even larger, but the county seat is Statesboro. But if someone lived on the outskirts, the very edge of Bulloch County in, say, the 1820s, but they were not able to just ride all the way into town to have information recorded, they might go where it is closer, which might have been Tatnall County or to Reedsville or so. Or they had to just wait for a circuit judge to pass through to have that information recorded. So that's why certain things in the courthouse and the probate court looks like it was recorded all on the same day, or it will have dates that it says this is when it happened, but was recorded this date, because it was so long after the event happened before it was actually recorded. And then often individuals married those who were close by because lack of transportation. And if you have ancestors, relative from this area or even royal areas in the southern states, you know that at some point you have got, we'll say, crossing of the branches. There are going to be different places where at some point someone who is related in some way made another marriage. But another reason that wasn't necessarily taboo or anything, if parents had 10 children and then those children each had 8 children, you have so many first cousins and then half of them all have different last names. You can't keep up with all of those. And if even half of those lived in the same area, I mean, I know I wouldn't, well, maybe not me. Most people would not be able to keep up with every first cousin they had. So you have to put yourself in that time period once again. It's not so much a taboo thing at that time period. It's a lack of transportation, it's who was there, and things like that. And one of the points at the bottom will reaffirm that. Legal terms did not always mean the same as they do today. That's very important when you do find information. You have to keep in mind, just like orphans, that is not the same as it is today. If a father died back in the 1800s, children were automatically considered an orphan just because the father was deceased, even though their mother might have still been alive and well. Mortality rate was much higher. So this resulted in multiple marriages and often to a sibling of the deceased spouse. So especially if a female died during childbirth, often the husband would marry one of her sisters. And that is for multiple reasons. A, he had a young child to care for often, and a sister would probably have lived close by. It's already her nieces or nephews and willing to help out. And then the same again with a wife who her husband might have died hunting trip, a war, battle, or something like that. If she were young, she would have no way of providing for herself. So that's why so many multiple marriages during that time. And do not be surprised to learn about illegitimate children and other secrets you never knew about your ancestors. This is something most people do not think about when they begin genealogy. This is kind of the taboo part, and I've encountered some that once they found out a secret, so to speak, they were kind of appalled, but you have to think you had no control over what your ancestors did, and it has no bearing on you. You can't change that. So I'm gonna, again, do a quick swap of the screen share to show an example that I actually just came across recently. So let me find where it's at. So this is my 4th great-grandfather. His name was Green W. Williford. He was from Stewart County and then went down to Mitchell County. He was married to Marthini Bullard and then Mary Ann Bullard, which, surprise, they were sisters. So one died in she died a few years after having a single child. But he was married to Mary Ann, which she went by Polly, which is a nickname for Mary. And their oldest son was James. And then they had several other children. On the 1900 census, and this is the census, which is slightly hard to read, I had a DNA match message me just a few weeks ago when we got to looking this up. So in this one, James is actually listed as the head of the household, who right here it says he is white, he's a male. He was born in May of 1867, 33 years of age, excuse me, and he's single. So even though he's the head of the household, it has both of his parents living here. So there's G.W. Williford, his mother, Polly. So his father is listed as a boarder, but then it has wife. And the reason we know these are his children, his father's age is 60, his mother's 55. And here it has number of children born, number of children living, which is one reason I love the 1900 census for that. And then it will tell you how many children are still there. 1, 2, 3, right there, and then 4. And she had two other children who were, I believe, married and had moved on by this point. But then if you notice right here, there is a Tom Williamson, or Williams, and it's listed as son, but if you notice, his race is very different, but he's also 20. So he is too old, actually, to be James's son, but he fits kind of the age gap to be Green Williford's son. But also down here, you have Tammy Grant, which her name was actually Tamara Grant, who's listed as a servant, but she's had 5 children and single, and she's 30 with all of these children. And again, this is 1900, but if we follow her children on their Social Security death index and things like that, they all list their father as either Jim Williford or James Williford. So, and he was never married, but he died in 1932, I believe. I think that's right. But anyway, or 1902, which would make sense. Her last child was born in 1902. So here is a father and a son who have children by different women, one who he is claiming as his son living with his wife. But that is something that was actually very common. And I'm very aware of it, well, aware of this one now. But when it comes to things like that, I don't know if you noticed the name of my family tree. It's called the Not Really Wingate family tree. You have to be open to finding things like that if you're going to be interested in genealogy. Just be aware of that. Let's see. All right, and this is something also that people do get frustrated with, and I do not blame you one bit. So, spelling of names and locations. In the 1820s, there were no spelling standards in the US that were followed by everyone. Most children in the South did not go to school and therefore were illiterate. Even though they may have been living in the same area for many generations, that does not mean the spelling of their surnames stayed the same, because often they didn't even know how to spell their own name. Accents played a large part in spelling of the names, as well as the person recording the name. They may have spelled it the way they heard it. Those who did go to school in the early 1800s or earlier were taught spelling and grammar by British standards. Those individuals were usually from well-born families and went to schools in the North. And so a lot of times those spelling standards, once they were brought down here, would really change the way names were spelled. During the mid-1800s, large populations of immigrants began coming to the US. And one thing most had in common is that they did not speak English. This is when you begin to find incredibly diverse spellings of names. Many immigrants later changed their names, but this was rarely official. One common misconception is that the people had their names changed to Ellis Island as they were coming in, but that is not true at all. You would have immigrants later kind of just say that their name was something else to be more Americanized, but the people at Ellis Island never changed their name. You also want to keep in mind that spellings of names may be different on different records. And these are some examples in my family. The given name was Selma, but variations on different records were Zelma, Zelda, Selena, but she had a German and Yiddish accent, so that kind of makes sense. But also someone might have gone by different names at different times. So for this example, my grandfather's name was Elias, and he went by, I'm going to guess he just probably couldn't pronounce his name as a young child because it was listed as Alice, which that kind of sounds similar, but then Alex, Eli, and Elias, but spelled differently. So I've already kind of mentioned accents, but you also have to think that some names were pronounced completely different in other countries that immigrants came from. So there are certain sounds that cannot even be replicated by the English alphabet. My grandmother was from Russia, and although I know her name and her parents' names, I often wonder if her real name might have been something completely different, because Russian is one of those languages that I could not say words or spell things. I mean, they have a Cyrillic alphabet, so really makes me wonder if that was her real name or one that she just kind of made up. And the person recording the information may have completely misheard it or simply chosen to record the name the way they thought it was spelled or differently. Or the way they thought it sounded. Handwriting can lead to many spelling errors, as everyone knows, since nearly all records were recorded and written in cursive. It's not always easy to read. I sometimes feel like census takers or enumerators and doctors were all taught to write the same way. Transcriptions of original records are also a common cause of spelling variations. The person transcribing the record misinterprets what was written, and that can be very misleading, especially when they get off track on census records. That can cause many issues. So these are a few final notes. You're going to make mistakes. Everyone does it first and even later. I still make mistakes. Some things you might just not catch at first. There are times that you might look at a record for so long that you just don't see things, and you put it down and come back to it a week, a month later, and all of a sudden it's staring you in the face. So it's important to review your previous work periodically. Sometimes you have to just put a certain line down and come back to it. You want to see if there are any spelling errors, dates that have gotten mixed up, something put in the wrong place, duplicated children or spouses due to nicknames. And that can happen easily, especially if you're not familiar with nicknames because they sound nothing like an original name. And that you do not have overlapping dates. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. And this is kind of what I mean. And I'm glad I don't have, or that I do have everyone muted because this might make you laugh. A female cannot have a child when she is not born yet, or only a toddler. Or if she's 65 years or older, typically, especially centuries ago, or after she has died. Men, on the other hand, can father children well into old age and father multiple children around the same time period. But once again, they cannot father a child when they themselves are a young child, not born, or deceased. And that might sound very trivial, but you would be surprised at how many people have put things like that into their tree. So genealogy is a never-ending puzzle. Enjoy putting the pieces together. And I also like to say it has no border. It's a puzzle that is finished when you decide it is finished. There is no actual end to it. So I'm going to show you a few last minute examples and then we'll be finished. So get that to go away. So real quick, this was my father's tree, and remember how I said little bits you might find details that just kind of set a spark off in you. This was what I found when I got started, and I actually only have to my second great-grandfathers on my father's side. But I found out that my great-grandfather has the same birthday as me, and also he was very, very short. I like that part too. And I also found out that my second great-grandmother has the same first name as me. That actually made me kind of do a little dance. So those are those tiny little details that I really liked. And this is what I mean by being the family historian and having things that others might not. And I don't mind sharing. So these are images of my father records that I have. This is my grandfather and father. If he doesn't kind of look like a gangster. This is information on the Purple Gang of Detroit. Got to find the right tab. So this is what I mean on overlapping tabs. So right here you have a D. Dobbins born in 1796, but his mother was born in 1826. I'm not the best at math, but I don't believe that is correct. Again, this is what I mean about overlapping dates. So you do have to be careful. Another example, this is from the same tree. Cleopatra, the 7th of Egypt, was born in 1983, but she died in 1920. And she was married to Gaius Julius Caesar IV, Roman Republic dictator. I'm guessing that's 100 AD, 44 AD, or BC, I'm not sure. But the only record she has is someone else's family tree, which means that she got this from someone else who got it from someone else and someone else. And also, she has this, Adam, first patriarch, which some interesting information, no dates, but he had 178 children, and he had one brother and one sister buried in Israel. Quite a family. So you have to be careful how you work your tree. You have to have facts. You have to have information. So start with what you know. If you notice where these are, I do not have death dates for nearly all of these. Right here, I have a death date, but I do not have a birth year. And the only reason for some of these is I have information from their children's death certificates and things like that, so that I've been able to prove certain things. I have multiple last names because those were on various documents. So there are different ways of proving things. You just have to be patient for one. All right. Let me Excuse me. Did I already stop the share? There we go. All right, so that is about it for today.